Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to start today's deep dive with a scenario that I think impacts the financial security of millions of people, communal governance.
Okay.
So imagine you get a notice for a substantial fee hike for your community maintenance. A massive increase in your maintenance management and common area contributions, your MMC.
hmm
You ask the obvious question. Show me the data. Show me the long-term plan that justifies this. And, instead of getting a robust, verifiable financial report, you just get a quick slide deck and this feeling of institutional indifference.
That feeling of
Sure.
being presented with an outcome without any traceable justification. That is the exact scenario we are diving into today.
It's so frustrating.
It is. And what you've shared with us is a truly phenomenal case study focused on something called the MMC Revision Committee. It's not just an example of, poor financial management. It's a clinical breakdown of what happens when the absolute bedrock of transparency and evidence is ignored by a governing body.
Absolutely. The sources lay out in, excruciating forensic detail how this committee went about its work, or maybe more accurately, how they avoided doing the necessary work.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
The analysis shows that the failure wasn't just like an accounting error. It was a systemic collapse that compromised their fiduciary responsibility and, crucially, led to what the analysts called a significant trust deficit within the community they were supposed to be serving.
And that trust deficit, that's the strategic failure here. Governance, especially financial governance, it all relies on legitimacy. If people don't understand the process that creates a financial recommendation, they can never, ever trust the outcome.
No matter how well-intentioned it might be.
Exactly. It doesn't matter. This is such a critical lesson for anyone involved in, shared community structures, condos, HOAs, you name it.
So our mission today, and this is tailored specifically for you, the learner, is threefold. We're going to analyze the two core failures in depth. First, the complete financial omission of key, frankly, legally required planning data.
And second, the total procedural opacity. The way they just turn the entire process into a black box.
A black box, I like that term. And then we're going to pivot from critique to construction. We will provide you with a comprehensive framework of corrective controls. This framework is your actionable blueprint.
That's the key. You will walk away from this deep dive knowing exactly what good governance looks like, and you'll be armed with the specific demands you can make to scrutinize and ultimately defeat decisions made in the dark.
So let's jump straight into the foundational problem. We have to start with the money, with the absolute abandonment of the evidence base. Okay, when we talk about data-driven decisions, especially when you are responsible for maintaining multi-million-dollar shared assets, buildings, roofs, common areas, elevators, there is one document, one roadmap that is simply non-negotiable, and that is the reserve study.
It's so crucial that we establish this right up front. The reserve study is not some, niche or esoteric accounting requirement designed to make things difficult. It is standard industry best practice.
Right, it's the baseline.
It's the absolute baseline. Organizations like the Community Associations Institute, the CAI, they don't just recommend it. They position it as the foundational requirement. It is, and I'm quoting from our sources here, unequivocally the core input to any data-driven budgeting. If you don't have this, everything else is just guesswork.
So if I'm walking into a meeting and I'm asking about the budget, how should I define what a robust reserve study even is? What am I looking for?
Conceptually, think of it as the ultimate preventative maintenance document. It blends a physical analysis with long-term financial forecasting. Its primary purpose is to allow the governing body to demonstrate proactive fiduciary responsibility.
And fiduciary duty. Just to be clear, that means managing someone else's money with the absolute highest degree of care, right?
The highest possible degree, like you're managing a child's trust fund. You must anticipate future needs. You can't just react to problems.
And without that anticipation, without the study, you are essentially forcing future owners or even current owners to face these massive, unpredictable, and potentially bankrupting one-time costs.
Precisely. The study identifies every major asset, the roof, the paving, the pool pump, and it estimates its remaining useful life. Then it calculates the projected cost to replace it when it eventually fails, and it correctly factors in things like inflation and market dynamics.
So you're not caught by surprise.
You're never caught by surprise. By funding these costs gradually over time, the study acts as this vital shield against conflict. It replaces speculation and, frankly, political maneuvering with objective data. It dramatically reduces the opportunity for those dreaded surprise fee hikes or special assessments that just blindside owners when a critical system fails.
So for you, the learner, if you're looking at a reserve study summary, what are the, say, 5 key pieces of data you must be able to verify to know that the budgeting committee has actually done its job?
This is the key. A robust study provides 5 non-negotiable outputs that have to be transparently disclosed to all the members. Okay, so first, the component list.
An inventory.
A clear inventory. It has to list every major shared asset, including a starting estimate of its expected lifespan. If the study says the roof will last 30 years, that's your starting point.
Okay.
Second, the remaining asset life estimates. This tells you, based on actual physical inspections, how many years are left before that replacement becomes mandatory. This is the timeline that governs your entire saving strategy.
So that lets me see. For example, we have 8 years left on the elevator before it costs, say, $400,000 to replace. I can now verify the urgency myself.
Correct, which leads to the third output, the replacement cost forecasts. This estimates the total cash you'll need for that elevator replacement, and it factors in an assumed inflation rate over those 8 years. This is the goalpost you're saving toward.
The target number.
The target number. Fourth, and this is arguably the most critical health metric for the whole community, is the current funded percentage.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, if, based on the projected costs, you should have $1 million in your reserve account right now, but your balance sheet only shows $500,000, you are 50% funded.
Oh, wow.
This tells the community instantly the size of the deficit they need to close and the level of risk they are carrying. A governing body that is underfunded is, by definition, failing in its fiduciary duty.
That puts a very concrete, very verifiable number on the risk.
It does. And finally, the fifth output, the recommended annual contribution needed. This is the specific figure, the amount per unit per month required to get that fund back to a healthy level and keep it there over the long term, avoiding those future special assessments.
So without those 5 specific auditable data points,
any recommendation on increasing MMC fees is, to put it simply, arbitrary. It completely lacks integrity.
and this brings us right to the core failure of the MMC Revision Committee. The sources state, I mean unambiguously, that there was no evidence of a current reserve study being tabled, summarized, or annexed as a foundational input.
They just skipped it.
They completely bypassed the financial roadmap.
This is the governance gap that defines this entire failure. The committee, tasked with restructuring community finances, proceeded without any objective long-term financial data. They relied on internal deliberations, maybe some short-term operating budget projections, and definitely slide presentations, but not the rigorous, documented analysis that the industry requires.
So instead of starting with those 5 objective financial truths we just talked about, they started with an internal preference for a number or a guess.
Exactly. And this is why their rate decisions are condemned as, quote, risking being arbitrary, non-evidence-based. If I tell you fees must go up by 30% and all I can show you is a PowerPoint slide that just says we need more money, I have fundamentally eroded your ability to perform any kind of due diligence.
You can't check their work.
You can't verify if the increase is necessary, if it's sufficient, or if it's even being properly directed.
And that leads directly to the risk that the reserve allocations could violate their legally specified purpose. This is a crucial point we need to spend some time on. What exactly are the different types of communal funds, and how does the lack of a study risk mixing them up in a legally damaging way?
This is where governance failure meets real statutory risk. Governing documents and often state or provincial laws mandate that funds collected for different purposes have to be kept separate. They can only be spent for those defined purposes. Think of it like your personal finances. You have different savings pots.
Right. I have my retirement fund, my emergency savings, and maybe my short-term vacation fund. I wouldn't pay my rent out of my 401k.
Precisely. Your reserve funds, sometimes called sinking funds, are the retirement fund of the property. They are strictly earmarked for the non-routine major capital repairs and replacements that are identified by the reserve study, the new roof, the replacement boiler. You cannot legally use them for anything else. Then you have your operating funds, which are your management or maintenance contributions. That's your monthly cash flow. It covers things like utility bills, gardening contracts, short-term repairs. That's your grocery budget.
And a project fund.
A project fund might be a temporary specific assessment for a new defined improvement, like installing new security cameras. That's your vacation savings pot.
So if this committee says, look, we have an operating shortfall this year because we mismanaged the payroll and we need to raise fees 10% to cover it, and then they allocate that 10% increase directly into the reserve fund.
They are committing a massive violation of the fund's legal purpose.
A huge one.
They're using money that should only be spent on the future capital structure of the building to cover a current operational shortfall. Without the reserve study, they lack the foundational documentation to prove that the allocation is for the legally specified purpose.
So they can't justify it.
They just decide they need more money. And by funneling it arbitrarily, they expose the governing body, and potentially the members who voted for it, to legal challenge. Their decision is ultra-virus. It's beyond their legal authority. The study is the necessary evidence that validates the purpose of the collection. Its omission means every financial recommendation is, by definition, operating in a statutory gray zone. Hashtag 1.3 consequences of unauditable rationale.
And this omission just, it guarantees a communication failure, doesn't it? The expected process, the standard of care, is to publish a clear member-facing summary, one that explains not just the final number, but the component timelines, the assets covered, and the very real consequences of underfunding.
But the observed reality, however, was a reliance on communications, where the rationale for these dramatic recommendations was not publicly documented in an auditable, machine-readable pack.
That phrase, machine-readable, is key. We need to unpack that. In simple terms, what does it mean for a financial document to not be machine-readable?
It means it's often a static image, a slide, a screenshot, or a non-exportable PDF. If you, the owner, cannot copy the data out of the document and paste it into a spreadsheet to verify the committee's calculations, to check their math, their inflation assumptions, their component list, then they are actively making it impossible for you to verify their work.
So they're hiding the rationale behind a layer of, what, bureaucratic friction.
An intentional layer of friction, that's exactly right.
And because of this, members receive the outcomes late, often only circulated with the AGM notice, without any time to process the sheer volume of information or verify the underlying data trail.
That's right. And what is the inevitable consequence when you combine a massive financial ask with technical opacity and delayed disclosure? It fosters a guaranteed immediate trust deficit.
Of course.
Even if the committee genuinely believed the fee hike was necessary, their failure to provide the transparent evidence, those 5 outputs of the reserve study, just heightened the perception that the hike was a calculated surprise.
So the community sees the outcome, the increase, but they don't see the justification. They don't see the why.
They see an arbitrary number imposed by a secret group. And this instantly increases the risk of member challenges, of conflict, and paradoxically, it prevents the governing body from effectively managing the property because their authority is now based on force, not on trust or demonstrable data. They focused entirely on producing the final fee number and completely ignored the public demand for the why, the transparent, auditable, long-term data trail that justifies that number.
That sets the stage perfectly for the second, and I'd argue perhaps even more damaging, failure, the total procedural blackout. The question moves from, did they use the right math, to did they even follow the rules?
Exactly. If part 1 was about failing to use the right financial tool, part 2 is about failing to use any governance tool correctly. This case study provides a perfect roadmap of how a committee can deliberately wall itself off from the community, transforming itself across its entire life cycle into a black box that operates without accountability.
The black box metaphor is chilling because it suggests deliberate exclusion. I mean, once the process started, you couldn't see inside, you couldn't verify the inputs, and you only saw the final non-negotiable output at the very end. This process failure undermined the committee's legitimacy before they even submitted their report. Hashtag tag 2.1, opaque formation and mandate, steps 1 to 5.
Accountability starts the moment a committee is conceived. If the formation process is murky, the subsequent findings will always carry an asterisk of doubt. In this case, the accountability clock was broken from the very first step.
Okay, so let's break this down. The formation phase. Step 1, the volunteer call. Where was the failure here?
The process was not transparently documented. A transparent process requires an archives public call for specific expertise, seeking members with finance, legal, or engineering backgrounds, and clearly defining the selection criteria. The observed failure was a total lack of public documentation.
Which results in a loss of openness.
And it means the committee risks being stacked.
Stacked with people who already agree with whatever outcome they want.
Precisely. If members can't see how volunteers were solicited and selected, they can't assess the committee's true representativeness, their competence, or potential conflicts of interest. The community loses the ability to say, wait a minute, why did you select 3 real estate agents and 0 financial planners for a financial revision committee? This selection criteria has to be public to ensure competency.
Then we move to the foundational document, the Terms of Reference, or TOR. This should be the committee's contract with the community, right?
It is the single most important legitimacy document. The TOR defines the scope, the authority limits, the mandatory data sources like the reserve study exclusions, deliverables, everything. The major gap here was that the TOR was not circulated in advance in a machine-readable format.
And if the TOR is hidden?
Members can't verify the scope of the committee. They can't check if the committee is overstepping its bounds or, conversely, failing to address critical items they were mandated to cover.
So the committee can just quietly expand or shrink its own mission without any public knowledge.
It makes the work non-accountable to a public mandate. The committee can claim later, well, the TOR said we only needed to look at operational costs. But the community has no way to check that claim. The work becomes an intellectually protected black box.
This opaqueness then naturally extended to the committee composition itself, steps 3 and 4. The list of volunteers and the rationale for selecting them was undisclosed. Why should the community care who is actually on the committee?
They must care, because they're being asked to trust the committee's findings. If I'm voting on a massive financial change, I need to know the qualifications, or the lack thereof, of the people drafting the policy. This isn't just about vetting for conflicts of interest. It's about basic competence. If the rationale is undisclosed, accountability and competence assessment become structurally impossible for the members. This is the first signal that governance integrity is being sacrificed for convenience, or for secrecy.
And the final foundational flaw in this mandate phase, the legal priority failure. This one deals with ultra vires decisions.
This is a complex but absolutely essential governance flaw. The TORs fail to explicitly state that law, statute, and binding court rulings take precedence over the committee's policy preference. This might sound like legal boilerplate, but it's a vital safeguard.
Can you give us an example? How could a committee's policy preference violate a statute?
Let's go back to the fun types. A committee might decide, based on their own internal preference, that it's okay to retrospectively charge owners for past shortfalls, essentially imposing a fee for past mismanagement, and then allocate that new charge to the reserve fund.
Right.
But if the governing statute dictates specific limitations on what constitutes a valid reserve fund contribution, then the committee's recommendation, though maybe financially compelling to them, is illegal. It's ultra vires. Without that explicit legal supremacy clause in the TORA, and without an independent...
So, once this committee was formed in this fundamentally opaque manner, the operational phase moved beyond just passive secrecy into active exclusion. This is where the black box is fully sealed.
Yes. This is where we see what the analysis calls exclusion by silence. In any transparent operation, the meeting schedules and agendas are publicly announced well in advance. Attendance should be allowed, and there should be formal channels for written submissions from members. The MMC Revision Committee failed on all of those counts.
So they were working behind closed doors, deciding policies that would affect hundreds of homes with zero public scrutiny.
Absolutely. And this means they intentionally forfeited the immense benefit of community expertise. Let's go back to your hypothetical engineer. Maybe they're a retired expert in high-rise HVAC systems. If the committee is deliberating on replacing the entire common area cooling plan, a multi-million-dollar decision, and this expert isn't even aware of the meeting schedule, their knowledge is completely excluded from the process.
And the committee proceeds with flawed or incomplete data.
Simply because they made the meetings non-public.
And what about the most critical failure in terms of record keeping? The lack of public minutes.
The minutes are the institutional memory of the process. They're supposed to record decisions, action items, financial data requests, and most importantly, any assumptions that were made. The failure to share minutes with the membership leads directly to the inevitability of surprise decisions.
Because if the committee assumes the building's security system only needs replacement in 10 years, but a member knows it's already obsolete, that member can't correct that assumption if they don't see the minutes until the final report is due.
That's the danger. By keeping the minutes secret, the committee denies owners the crucial opportunity to course-correct errors or misunderstandings early in the process. They would be months into a flawed revision based on an easily correctable false premise. Transparency allows for rapid, community-driven course correction. Procedural opacity guarantees that fundamental failures will just compound in secret, leading to a massive, embarrassing revelation at the end. #TAG 2.3. Failure to consult and engage. Steps 8-10.
Even with perfect data and recorded minutes, which this committee completely lacked, if you fail to engage the stakeholders before finalizing the report, you strip the policy of its participatory legitimacy. The community needs to feel some ownership of the policy, not like it's being imposed on them.
And the committee failed spectacularly on consultation, which is essential for informed consent. The first failure was concerning draft findings. Drafts were not circulated for review and comment before the AGM. The recommendations only surfaced late, often just, appended to the AGM minutes.
So the committee essentially presented a finalized take-it-or-leave-it document.
Exactly. This means affected parties, the owners and the community at large, they cannot evaluate or contest the practical impacts of the policy before it's adopted. This violates the entire spirit of consensus building. Why is this so structurally important? Because the committee holds the internal specialized knowledge and the community holds the external practical knowledge. You need time to reconcile the two.
And that leads to the second failure, the lack of a structured public comment period.
Right. A legitimate process requires a defined window, 14, 21, or 30 days, where members can submit formal comments on the draft. And crucially, the committee must document the disposition of those comments. Did they accept the feedback? Did they reject it? If they rejected it, why? In the absence of this structured consultation, the policy analysis concludes that the committee's work appears imposed rather than deliberated. You don't get participatory legitimacy by fiat. You get it through documented feedback and response.
And the final major failure of engagement, the lack of formal debate.
This is so consequential. No town hall-style sessions were scheduled. No sessions to discuss findings in detail, record questions, or allow for alternate formal proposals to be put forward. Why is this critical? Because complex financial and legal choices cannot be properly vetted in the limited, often hurried time frame of an annual general meeting.
Right, AGMs are fundamentally business meetings. They're not policy workshops.
They are formalities. By forcing the decision into the AGM, the committee guaranteed that the vote would be based on limited, surface-level information and emotion, not a full, nuanced understanding of the long-term financial and legal implications. Informed consent is severely compromised when the opportunity for open, public debate is purposefully removed from the process. Hashtag 2.4 accountability failure at the finish line. Steps 11-13.
Okay, so even after all that operational secrecy and the total failure to consult, the final reporting stage lacked the fundamental documentation needed for members to approve any decisions with integrity. The black box just spits out a recommendation, but there's no formal paperwork to trace who actually owns that decision.
This is the accountability collapse. Let's look at the decision record. The pathway for acceptance or rejection by the Governing Management Committee, the MC, it wasn't traceable to a signed, auditable record. In robust governance, the MC has to formally minute its decision, its vote, its detailed rationale for accepting or rejecting, and the specific names of the accountable signatories.
Without that, the responsibility it evaporates.
It disperses into the collective. If a recommendation proves flawed 6 months later, say, the cost forecasts were severely underestimated, responsibility cannot be attributed to specific individuals who signed off on the rationale. This failure to formalize decisions ensures a severe lack of post-facto decision rationale and prevents any real accountability.
Then we get to the AGM package standard. If I am asked to vote on a multi-million-dollar policy, what should I receive and what did they actually deliver?
You should receive the gold standard, a complete machine-readable package. This includes the full final report, the terms of reference, all the committee minutes, any accompanying legal opinion, and the verifiable financial tables, the reserve study outputs. And it must be circulated at least 14 days in advance.
And what the MMC received was?
What?
A set of non-machine readable, signed recommendations as an appendix, circulated late.
That's right. This is the definition of compromised integrity at the ballot box. Members are asked to approve a sweeping financial change without the ability to validate the underlying evidence, the legal context, or the full record of deliberation. You are not voting based on facts. You are voting based on the committee's summary of the facts, which is a massive, massive distinction.
And the final step, the lack of document control. This seems like a technicality, but it has severe legal implications.
Oh, it is absolutely not a technicality. It's the foundation of evidence. Relying on slides, on non-version documents, or non-machine readable formats creates severe evidentiary weakness. Why? If a document isn't version-controlled, searchable, and archived with a stable public register, it is far easier for the committee to later alter content, deny authorship, or claim a specific data point was only preliminary.
So if I, as an owner, challenge their cost estimate in court and they claim the version I have is outdated, how do I prove otherwise?
You can't. Not unless a central, traceable public register enforces version control, strict document control using version numbers, searchable text, clear publishing dates, and a public archive ensures that the record is immutable and verifiable. It protects both the committee when it is right and the community when the committee is wrong.
This entire procedural collapse, from formation to reporting, demonstrates that even if the financial numbers were somehow accidentally correct, the process rendered them illegitimate because the community had no verifiable basis to trust them.
The abandonment of process is the abandonment of governance. And now, having meticulously detailed the blueprint for failure, we must transition to the actionable solution. The corrective controls developed from this case study provide a perfect strategic framework for future success.
All right, this is the section where we move from identifying the problems to giving you, the learner, the tools to demand better governance. This corrective framework is essentially a strategic checklist you can deploy in your own community meetings. And we have to start where the original failure started, with the money. Hashtag 3.1, mandating evidence and financial accountability.
The policy has to change to stipulate that financial decisions are always evidence-based. We must stipulate that no material MMC increase, and by that I mean anything beyond typical annual inflation adjustments, can be approved without a current reserve study or an equally robust documented reserve funding plan. This mandate removes the possibility of arbitrary budgeting. Period.
And what specific tangible documents should the community demand be published in the AGM pack related to those reserves?
They need to publish a full executive summary of the reserve study, but more importantly, a mandatory reserve funding note. This note has to be high value and easily understood. It must include summary tables of those 5 key data points we discussed, a detailed FAQ explaining component life and replacement costs, and a mandatory open invitation for questions to be submitted in advance.
That's a massive improvement over a single slide.
And we have to ensure the data doesn't go stale. The policy must mandate a continuous review cycle. The full reserve study should be refreshed by an external expert every 3 to 5 years, and the financial components must be updated annually to reflect actual works completed, new inflation projections, and any changes in asset condition. This ensures the data is always fresh, relevant, and legally sound. Hashtag 3.2 formalizing committee launch and mandate.
Okay, moving back to procedure. How do we guarantee that the next committee isn't created in the shadows? How do we build a transparent, accountable body from the ground up?
We enforce documentation from step 1. First, we mandate the publication of a formal, archived call for volunteers. This call has to specify clear eligibility criteria, the required time commitment, and the objective selection methodology. This completely removes the risk of stacking the committee based on undisclosed preferences.
And addressing that black box mandate failure, the terms of reference.
We must enforce the advanced publication of a version-controlled, machine-readable terms of reference. This ensures that the scope is searchable, stable, and public before any work begins. And crucially, this TOR must include a specific, prominent legal supremacy clause.
The one we talked about before.
Exactly. It has to explicitly state that all recommendations are conditional upon review against statute and law, overriding any internal policy preference. This protects the community from those ultra-vires decisions.
So if I'm preparing for a vote on forming a committee, I should demand to see the TOR first, and I should check for that legal supremacy clause.
It should be your first strategic demand. And finally, the launch has to be public and recorded. We need to announce the final committee charter, the full roster of selected members with their disclosed relevant experience, and key milestones in a public, actively maintained tracker. This replaces hidden formation with visible accountability from the very start. Hashtag 3.3, ensuring operational transparency and participation.
This set of controls is about shifting the culture from exclusion by silence to active, sustained engagement. How do we force the committee to open its doors?
By mandating public operational standards. The committee must publish a public meeting calendar and agenda well in advance. They have to allow open attendance, even if it's only for observation, and they must actively solicit and accept written submissions from any member. This ensures that valuable community expertise is included, not accidentally excluded.
And prompt publication of the minutes. How quickly should the community demand those key records?
Promptness is key to effective course correction. Policy should mandate the prompt publication of meeting minutes, ideally within 7 business days of the meeting. The minutes must include an action tracker and link to any data annexures or internal reports that were discussed. If a flawed assumption is made, the community needs 7 days, not 7 months, to challenge it.
Okay, and addressing the consultation failure, how do we ensure the community is engaged before the final report is locked down?
We establish a mandatory public feedback loop. First, require the circulation of draft reports for a defined comment period, let's say 14 days, before the report is finalized. Second, and this is highly actionable for you, the learner, the committee, must create and publish a comment register with a committee response matrix.
Tell me more about that response matrix. Why is that so essential?
The response matrix is the proof that consultation was deliberation, not just lip service. It requires the committee to log every formal piece of feedback they received and document line by line how that feedback was handled, accepted, rejected, or modified. If it's rejected, they must provide a concise, published rationale. This ensures policy transparency and real participatory legitimacy.
And finally, forcing the debate that was avoided before the AGM.
We must mandate that the committee schedule at least one open town hall or debate session. And this isn't just a quick Q&A. It's a forum to discuss the findings, record the full Q&A session, and publish a detailed FAQ based on member concerns, all before the AGM. This proactive debate is the necessary foundation for achieving true informed consent from the voters. Hashtag 3.4, standardizing reporting and post-decision accountability.
So the final step is closing the loop, ensuring that once a decision is made, it is traceable, enforceable, and accountable long after the committee disbands.
We need robust accountability mechanisms at the finish line. The first is enforcing that minimum AGM package standard we discussed. The governing body must circulate the complete machine-readable package, the full report, TOR, minutes, legal opinion, financial tables, at least 14 days in advance. This eliminates that late, incomplete appendix dump.
And making sure the decision itself is actually owned by someone.
Yes. Formalize all decisions with a signed resolution text and a rationale note. This record has to identify the accountable signatories who reviewed and accepted the final policy recommendation. If the decision pathway is ever audited or challenged, you can instantly attribute responsibility and trace the decision rationale back to specific people and dates, fulfilling that fiduciary requirement.
And strengthening the technical foundation, document control.
Enforce strict document control with mandatory versioning and maintain a public central document register. This eliminates the evidentiary weakness that plagued the original committee. Every document must be archived, searchable, and linked to a stable, traceable version number.
And finally, accountability doesn't end with the vote, does it? It extends into implementation. What happens after the fees are approved?
The governing body must publish a post-decision implementation standard operating procedure, an SOP. This details exactly how the new policy will be rolled out. And crucially, they must also publish a clear grievance mechanism and exceptions process for owners to challenge the implementation if it's perceived as arbitrary or unfair. This creates a continuous channel of accountability and ensures the policy is not just adopted, but carried out transparently and fairly, year after year. Hashtag OCHIURO.
This deep dive has provided a really powerful synthesis of failure and remedy. The key lesson for you, the learner, I think, is this. Good governance is not about the final financial outcome. It's about the integrity and transparency of the process used to reach it.
The MMC Revision Committee's failure was fundamentally twofold. They committed a financial crime against diligence by abandoning the reserve study, which rendered their outcomes arbitrary. And they committed a procedural crime against legitimacy by operating as a black box, excluding participation and preventing accountability at every single step.
And every corrective control we just detailed in Part 3 is an insurance policy against those specific systemic failures. You now have a strategic framework. When you're facing any future committee or proposal, you can deploy this checklist immediately. Does the terms of reference include a legal supremacy clause? Are the minutes published promptly with data annexures? Is the financial increase tied directly to an audited reserve study, complete with a response matrix showing how community feedback was actually handled?
This case study provided us with a textbook blueprint for failure. But the corrective controls developed from that analysis provide an equally perfect blueprint for successful, accountable governance. So, for your final takeaway and critical evaluation, if a governing body faced with clear, accessible best practices, insist on operating in secrecy, refusing to share minutes, avoiding open discussion, and bypassing the use of standard financial evidence, what assumptions should the community always make about the validity, the legitimacy, and frankly, the legality of their final recommendations?
That is the critical question. Use this framework to demand total transparency and never settle for decisions made in the dark. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.